Hi, it's Nathan. WHS Codes of Practice sit below the regulations in the legislative framework. So you have the Act that sits at the top, which is like the main overarching legal document that gives duties to different parties, gives the power to the regulator, that sort of stuff. Very important document, but doesn't really give you any practical advice. The regulations sit underneath the Act, which give some advice on how to comply with the Act. The regulations will start to give some practical advice. So for example, the regulations will say you need to have a SWIMS for high-risk construction work, or you need to have a permit for confined space entry work. But that's pretty much it. No more practical guidance. Once you get down to the codes of practice, this is where you can actually get practical, useful guidance on how to manage certain situations or how to manage certain risks. But in saying that, they aren't law as such. The codes of practice are about as close as you can get to a legal document without actually being legally enforceable. The status of the codes under the Act is the codes can be used to determine what you could have done or what you should have done. So for example, let's say we have a worker fall from height and injure themselves. Typically you would just be prosecuted, or you could be prosecuted under the Act, just typically under Section 19, which is just your primary duty of care to ensure the safety of workers. But that would also be a breach of like the regulations, our duty to manage the risk of falls. And then there's also a code of practice on how to manage the risk of falls. So even though you won't be prosecuted as a breaching the code, let's say hypothetically, we haven't followed the code to a T, and you probably wouldn't have. There's a lot of codes out there. But let's say hypothetically you haven't followed the code of practice. You'll be charged under the Act. There's probably a breach of the regulations as well. But where the codes of practice will come in is, if we're going through court proceedings, they'll use the code of practice to say, oh, well, this is what you could have done, or this is what you should have done. So generally speaking, yes, you should follow the codes of practice. Where that becomes problematic is there's about 30 codes of practice. If you're in construction or industrial sort of setting, at least half of those are going to apply to you. And they're anywhere from 20 to 100 pages each. So just the sheer bulk of material in there is going to make it impossible for you to implement, I would argue. Or good luck trying, but that should always be the goal. So yeah, things to remember. If you're a business owner, you should really focus on the codes that are relevant to your business, obviously. If you're in asbestos removal, you should know what that code says. If you're a safety person, you should at the very least know which codes exist, and then, so that you can access them if you ever have a sort of practical query as to what you should be doing or what the business you work for should be doing. But yeah, the idea that anyone's going to be able to remember all these and implement all these is sort of optimistic, let's say. So yeah, what do the codes cover? There's codes, they're set up similar to the regulations. There's codes that cover sort of general principles, so risk management, or how to manage WHS risks, and then really common hazards that are relevant for every business, so things like manual handling and falls, and then it gets sort of industry specific, so you start to get to like asbestos removal and hazchem. And then there's state-specific sort of stuff as well, which is annoying because even though we're on the model stuff, there's state-specific stuff. So Victoria never adopted the model codes or model act and regs, so they call theirs compliance codes. And then, for example, even in states on the model regulations and act and codes, there's differences there. So for example, in Queensland, we've got a bunch of codes that are sort of like legacy codes, or written before the harmonized or model legislation came into use. So mobile cranes, there's someone like cane industry specific codes, cash in transit codes. So these are all codes that are sort of like legacy. They used to exist, and when the model stuff came in, they didn't get rid of them, they kept them. So yeah, that's it. That's codes of practice. Hope that helps.